name is Mahana. I'm a second year, third semester. Respected professors, faculties, staff, and the dear students. Today I'm going to be presenting on Panpsychism and the affinity of matter for being. So, the aim of my presentation is to explore whether atoms as the most fundamental units of matter carry proper consciousness and how this idea relates to life, death and the nature of living. As Aristotle said, philosophy begins in wonder. His words remind us that how human curiosity is the base of all philosophical inquiry. For the earliest time, humans have marveled at the sun, moon, stars, clouds, and so on, and the mystery of life and death. They were amazed, scared, and curious. At first, they were mostly scared and viewed these things as magic. The humans tried to control them but did not understand. Over time, this curiosity and wonder evolved into structured knowledge, like science, religion, and eventually philosophy itself. As Mahana notes in his book, A Critical History of Eastern Philosophy. Philosophy begins with these big questions about world, ourselves, and existence. One of the deepest questions we face is why does life exist, and why does its end feel so troubling? Life can be understood as the possession of consciousness, the awareness, or the being that makes experience possible. And death, by contrast, represents the loss of that consciousness, the cessation of that being. These definitions that life is somewhat associated with consciousness is not null or arbitrary, but rather a classical definition in both Indian and Western tradition, with the following proofs. Like in Advaita, life is associated with Atman or pure consciousness. Aristotle, in his work, De Anima, says life is the presence of psyche or soul, and death is the body without a soul. Descartes, in his meditation, states that a living being is a conscious body or being. The essence of mind is thinking or consciousness, and a body without mind is a machine. David Sharma, a recent day philosopher and panpsychist, defines consciousness as the central feature distinguishing life from the non-living in terms of experience. In this world, the conscious man. The contemporary Indian philosopher Shiva states that consciousness is equal to fundamental thing in existence. So today, we will be exploring a radical yet grounded idea, that is, theory of Panpsychism, followed by what is proto consciousness and how it is regarded to the resistance to non-being, that is death, and attachment to living, that is life. Now, once we see life as the presence of consciousness and death as its loss, the next big question that naturally arises is where does consciousness itself come from? To answer this, I have taken two key ideas in philosophy, Panpsychism and proto-consciousness. Panpsychism, this word is a combination of two Greek words, pan and psyche, where pan means all and psyche means soul or spirit. In other words, it is a view that consciousness is not limited only to human beings or animals, but that it is a basic feature of reality itself. So as per this view, every part of nature, even the smallest particles, carry some traces of consciousness. The forerunners of Panpsychism are, in ancient and modern days, Thales, Anaxagoras, Leibniz, Spinoza, and in recent days, Schopenhauer, William James, Whitehead supported this view. In contemporary philosophy, Strawson, David Sharma, and Philip Goff has talked about this theory. Then what is proto-consciousness? It's means primitive awareness. This is the name of the basic, primitive, or fundamental form of awareness. This is not full self-consciousness, but doesn't mean that atoms think or feel like we do, but that they possess a very simple and fundamental form of inner experience, that is primitive or initial form of consciousness. Modern day philosophers like William James, Whitehead, and Sharma have supported these views. This idea that atoms might carry a spark of consciousness is not just a new or random, but it rather has deep roots both in ancient and modern day philosophy. In the West, Leibniz spoke of Monad, the tiny units of perception that is almost like saying atoms themselves are really centers of experience. In Indian tradition, like Vedanta says, consciousness is the one reality present everywhere, and Buddhism speak of existence as made up of brief moments of experience, which is called Dhamma. Even in modern day philosophy, David Sharma, Strawson, and Bob argues that consciousness cannot be explained away and it must be taken as something fundamental. The materialist Charvaka in India said consciousness is not basic. It comes only when the matter is organized in a very special way. That consciousness arises when the matter is combined in a certain way. However, Panpsychism, in contrast, says a trace of consciousness is already there, even in the smallest units, long before complex life appears. And this brings up a fascinating question that if atoms themselves carry total consciousness, could that be why we cling to life so much? And why does the thought of death stirs such resistance in us? Could that be, at the most fundamental level, consciousness itself trying to survive? Let's try to answer that question. If atoms carry even the faintest trace of awareness, then life and death are more than just biological event. That is, they are a movement of consciousness itself. Life is the coming together of these tiny sparks into higher and richer awareness, and death, by contrast, is when that organization breaks apart, scattering consciousness back into simpler traces, although it doesn't mean that it fully dissolves it. In a nutshell, it can say life as the smaller elements of awareness combining together to form higher consciousness, and death as higher consciousness breaking apart into smaller traces. So here is my interpretation, that if atoms do carry total consciousness, then our deep pull toward being and our resistance to death are not merely psychological or biological, but also ontological. Atoms naturally tend to organize into systems where consciousness can grow. Non-being or death feels troubling because it represents the opposite, the dissolution of that organized awareness. So then, this fear of death or the love of life is not merely psychological, but comes from the most basic unit of the life itself. To understand it better, we can look at how different philosophers and philosophy across time and places have approached the idea that smallest building blocks of reality might already contain seed of awareness. In ancient Greek philosophy, classical atomists like Democritus and Epicurus saw atoms as lifeless indivisible matter. Although this contrasts my interpretation, it sets the stage for understanding the world as built from tiny fundamental particles. Leibniz proposed in his theory of monads that monads are indivisible, self-contained center of proto-consciousness and the tiny units carrying minimal awareness. Monads, by contrast to physical atoms, they are metaphysical. In Indian philosophy, uh, Advaita Vedanta teaches that Brahman is the ultimate reality, which is the pure consciousness, and it's present everywhere. Even if not in atomic terms, it provides the philosophical background for seeing awareness or consciousness as all-pervasive. Buddhism describes reality as made up of elementary experiential units called dharmas, each carrying some measure of awareness, hinting at proto-conscious elements at the most basic level. In Buddhism, the reality is understood in terms of dharmas, but dharmas are the smallest momentary units that make up everything. Each dharma carries a tiny experiential quality. And in my interpretation, it resonates with the idea of proto-consciousness. Just as atom may carry a minimal spark of awareness, thermas carry a momentary experience which combines to produce the phenomena we perceive. Vaisheshika school, the classical Indian atomists describe reality as composed of parmanus or fundamental units. Its combination generates observable phenomena. While Vaisheshika does not explicitly attribute consciousness to its atom, the subtle qualities of parmanus can be interpreted as proto-consciousness. They are fundamental units of matter. Parmanus carry subtle qualities known as gunas that produce observable properties when combined. But later commentators like in Vedanta suggested that these atoms of Vaisheshika might also carry a potential for consciousness. Contemporary Indian philosopher Sri Aurobindo in The Life Divine states that the microcosm is nothing but consciousness arranging itself. When consciousness arranges itself in the form of an electron and the atom or material object, in reality it is still consciousness at work determining the form and its evolutions. This means even what we perceive as rigid matter is fundamentally conscious in a subtle form. Moving to the recent times, thinkers like David Sharma, Galen Strawson and Philip Goff have carried the idea of panpsychism forward. As per Sharma, the hard problem of consciousness is the question why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to the subjective experiences. He reminds us that this problem has led some, like panpsychists, to think that consciousness must already exist at the fundamental level. Strawson puts it bluntly as if consciousness exists itself, it must go all the way down. That it means even the tiniest parts of reality carry a spark of experience. He adds, experience is present all the way down. If experience exists, then it must exist as a fundamental feature of reality. Philip Goff argues, consciousness is not a special or extra ingredient in the recipe of reality. It is the basic and as fundamental as space, time, and mass. He emphasizes that consciousness should be treated like space or time, not something that suddenly appears, but a building block of the universe itself. These contemporary voices chimed in The idea that even the smallest unit of reality might carry traces of awareness, supporting our interpretation that humans' deep pull toward life and resistance to death reflects the underlying structure of existence. Now, if we imagine for a moment that atoms carry even the faintest trace of total consciousness, if that is the case, our drive to life and fear of death might not be just philosophical, psychological, or biological, or cultural, but rather they could reflect a fundamental feature of reality itself. In, in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, it is said that the self is dearer than all the things. This suggests that existence itself values life, showing a natural pull toward continuity and conscious existence. Sri Aurobindo in The Life Divine writes that matter is veiled life and life is veiled consciousness. This, he states that the consciousness is a fundamental thing and the fundamental thing in the existence. The microcosm is nothing but consciousness arranging itself, and when consciousness arranges itself in the form it becomes the electron, the atoms, the material object. In reality, it is still consciousness that works in the energy and determines the form and the evolution of form. Here, consciousness is inherent in matter, supporting the idea that even the smallest units carry conscious tendencies, and that life emerges from these conscious foundations. Moving to the west, Schopenhauer describes the will to live as the inner essence of all beings, a striving that resists non-being. And Heidegger similarly notes that although we are beings toward death, our everyday existence is shaped by our subtle but persistent attempt to cling to life. Philip Roth criticizes the materialist approach. He argues that consciousness is woven into the fabric of matter. So perhaps our love of life and fear of death are not just human experiences. They may echo a universal tendency towards being itself. The consciousness is built into matter itself. If that is the case, then our love of life and fear of death might be expressions of the way reality itself is structured. But no theory is without its challenges and critiques, and this one also is no exception. Having considered that the idea that the atoms may carry a spark of total consciousness, we must know that how this pause and turn into the critical question we raise. First off, atoms are tiny and lifeless particles. Then how can they have consciousness? Here, we're not talking about human-like thought or feelings, but total consciousness is a minimal basic tendency toward awareness, a potential for experience. Think of it as a seed, small, latent, and able to grow into full consciousness when organized into complex systems. Next, how is this different from the classical materialist views like Taoism? Panpsychism differs because it persists consciousness as a fundamental property of matter. Even atoms already contain a total conscious part. And the critique asks, does this really explain consciousness or just move the mystery down one level? The answer could be it reframes the problem, showing consciousness may be built in rather than emergent. Then, is this theory metaphysical or scientific? So, total consciousness is mostly metaphysical. It cannot be directly observed, but it is consistent with philosophical thinking and with modern debates in philosophy of mind. Its value lies in conceptual clarity, guiding both scientific and ethical research. Another big question is, how do these proto-conscious units combine into full consciousness? This is the famous problem of combination. One idea is that proto-conscious units integrate in complex structure like neurons in the brain, forming the consciousness of the experience. The critique highlights that we do not yet know the exact mechanism, but acknowledging the problem is a part of philosophical honesty. So if atoms have affinity for being, why does that happen? The atomic affinity does not guarantee immortality. Life and death are two sides of the same puzzle. The atoms organize into systems, life, and then dissolve, death. The drive towards being is still present even if the structure is temporary. So can we observe proto-consciousness directly? Proto-consciousness is too subtle to detect directly. We see its effects indirectly in organized systems like brain, ecosystem, and living organisms, just like we detect the wind by observing the leaves move. If atomic tendency favor being, why do beings sometimes reject life? How can we define suicide or life denial or suffering? What I think about this exception is proto-consciousness operates at a fundamental level, while psychological, social, and biological factors can override it. This doesn't negate the theory, but it shows higher order of phenomena interact with atomic tendencies. So, does panpsychism solve the hard problem introduced by Shalom about consciousness? Panpsychism doesn't fully solve it, instead, it reframes the problem. Consciousness exists at all levels, so the question becomes how it manifests, not why it emerges from it. And the last one is, if atoms already contain proto-consciousness, why do they combine to attain higher forms? Explanation. Combination allows proto-consciousness to manifest more richly, like simple notes forming a symphony. The drive to organize could itself be an expression of the underlying tendency toward being. The critique questions whether proto-conscious atoms really explain life, consciousness, and human fear as well. Possible response. It reframes consciousness as fundamental, provides a conceptual framework, and acknowledges limits like the combination problem. It also opens the door to ethical reflections and new ways to understand life. Recognizing proto-consciousness encourages ecological ethics and respect for all life at all levels. While not empirically testable, it frames a responsible worldview. So, what does all this mean for us? Having explored the idea that atoms may carry proto-consciousness, and having considered the details of this theory, let us now examine its broader implications. If atoms truly carry even the smallest trace of consciousness, life can be understood as the organization of these proto-conscious units into a system capable of higher awareness. Death, by contrast, is the breaking down of that organization. This suggests that our natural drive toward life and resistance to death are not merely psychological but ontological itself. They may reflect underlying structure of reality itself. This view also reshapes our understanding of ethics and our relationship with the environment. If awareness is present even in basic matters, then the boundary between living and non-living system is not absolute. Such a framework encourages a more considered approach to how we interact with the natural world. At the same time, the important question remains: how do these proto-conscious units combine to produce unified context consciousness? Can we meaningfully ascribe awareness to entities as simple as atoms? Are we projecting human concepts onto fundamental matter? Panpsychism addresses some of these questions, but the theory cannot yet fully explain the mechanism involved. Despite these limitations, examining the world through the lenses of total consciousness offers a new way of thinking about existence, life, and death. We can see the shift of the focus from seeing consciousness as emerging solely in complex system to recognizing it as a fundamental feature of reality. In conclusion, while total consciousness and panpsychism raises as many questions as they answer, they provide a philosophical framework that connects the smallest constituent of matter with the universal phenomena of life and awareness. By considering these possibilities, we expand our understanding of reality and of why life seeks to persist and resist dissolution at all levels. And maybe, just maybe, even in the smallest atom, there is a whisper of darkness.